She looked at him the way people look at someone who has wandered into the wrong room. He was wearing a gray suit that had seen better years, carrying a briefcase that belonged in a thrift store, and he had arrived 3 minutes late because the elevator in her building required a key card he hadn't been issued. When he extended his hand across the conference table, calm, unhurried, like a man with nothing to prove, Victoria Sterling looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, then turned away and resumed speaking to her board. "I think we've covered everything that matters today," she said. No one corrected her. No one said a word. Logan Mercer picked up his briefcase, nodded once at the room, and walked out. He was in his car before anyone in that boardroom understood what had just left the building. If you've ever been dismissed before you had the chance to speak, stay with me. Watch until the end. Hit like, follow the channel, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Logan Mercer drove into Manhattan, he got stuck behind a garbage truck on 57th Street for 11 minutes. He didn't honk. He didn't check his phone more than once. He sat with the window cracked and drank lukewarm coffee from a thermos his daughter had decorated with star stickers when she was 6, and he listened to a sports radio segment about a basketball team that had no realistic shot at the playoffs. The host was optimistic anyway, which Logan appreciated. He'd always had a soft spot for people who chose optimism in the face of clear evidence. His car was a 2009 Volvo with 140,000 miles on it, gray with a small dent above the rear left wheel well from when his daughter, Nora, had backed her bicycle out of the garage without looking. He'd never gotten it fixed. It didn't bother him. A dent was just a dent. He found a parking garage 3 blocks from Sterling Technologies headquarters and paid for 2 hours, which he figured was more than enough. The meeting was scheduled for 45 minutes. He was already building in margin. Logan Mercer was 35 years old and had more money than he would ever spend in 3 lifetimes. He did not think about this often. It wasn't false modesty. It was simply that money, to Logan, had never been the primary unit of measurement for anything important. He measured things in other ways, in whether a company's leadership actually understood what they were building, in whether the people making decisions knew how to listen, in whether, when things went wrong, and things always went wrong, the people at the top had the character to absorb the weight of it without pushing it down onto everyone below them. These were the things Logan thought about in parking garages and during 11-minute traffic delays behind garbage trucks. He straightened his tie in the elevator. The tie was dark blue, conservative, the kind his late wife Claire had always called his serious tie when she was teasing him. She'd bought him 3 ties that were bolder, a deep burgundy, a hunter green, a slate gray with a subtle texture, and he'd worn all 3 to her funeral because he couldn't decide which one she would have wanted and eventually just layered them across the back of the chair where he sat, which had made her sister laugh through her tears, which he was pretty sure had been the right instinct. That was 5 years ago. He still kept the ties. He never wore them. The elevator reached the 34th floor and opened onto a lobby that was genuinely impressive. Sterling Technologies had done something interesting with the space. It didn't feel like a tech company trying to look like a tech company. There were no exposed pipes painted in primary colors, no foosball tables visible from the entrance, no mission statement stenciled in oversized sans serif across the wall. Instead, the lobby felt almost like a museum. Clean lines, natural materials, a long reception desk in pale oak, walls hung with technical drawings framed like art. It was the aesthetic of a company that wanted to be taken seriously. Logan noticed this. He noticed most things. "Logan Mercer," he told the receptionist. "I have a 10 o'clock with Ms. Sterling." The receptionist, young, efficient, wearing the kind of practiced neutral expression that suggested she'd been trained to reveal nothing, checked her screen and then looked at him for just a half-second longer than was strictly necessary. "Of course," she said. "I'll let them know you're here. Can I offer you anything while you wait?" "I'm fine," Logan said. "Thank you." He sat in one of the chairs along the window and looked out at the city. From 34 floors up, Manhattan had a particular quality in the morning light, a kind of steely brightness that made everything look both permanent and temporary at once. He'd grown up in Pittsburgh, where the light was different, heavier, more forgiving. He'd moved to New York in his late 20s and had never quite stopped noticing the contrast. He thought about Nora, briefly. She was at school. Third grade, Mrs. Callahan's class, which she declared every Monday morning to be the best class in the whole school, and every Friday to be kind of boring, actually. She was the most honest person he knew. He was picking her up at 4. At 10:07, a man in his late 30s emerged from the corridor behind the reception desk. His name tag identified him as Derek Pullman, Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships. He had the handshake of someone who'd been coached on handshakes and was still consciously executing the coaching. Firm grip, 2 pumps, direct eye contact. Mr. Mercer, great to have you here. He held the grip a beat longer than necessary. Victoria's just wrapping up a quick call. She's looking forward to meeting you. Logan had been told this about corporate meetings so many times that the phrase had become essentially meaningless, like, the check is in the mail, or we'll be in touch. He smiled anyway. Great. The conference room they led him to was on the 35th floor, accessed by an interior staircase rather than the public elevator, which Logan noted as a subtle signal. A private floor, a protected space. The room itself was large and deliberately impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the East River, a table that seated 16 and currently held 7, a presentation screen at the far end displaying the Sterling Technologies logo in motion, cycling slowly through a sequence of blues and silvers. 7 people were already seated. Logan recognized 2 from public profiles. A venture partner named Elaine Cho and a board member named Richard Hausman, who had been on the Forbes 400 list for the better part of 2 decades. The others he didn't know by name, but he knew their type. Senior leadership, there to observe and calibrate, careful not to commit to anything before their boss was in the room. He took a seat near the middle of the table. Nobody offered introductions. He didn't push for them. At 10:14, Victoria Sterling entered. She moved through the doorway with the kind of efficiency that suggested she was almost always in motion. Her wheelchair a piece of equipment as natural to her as a briefcase was to someone else. An extension of her momentum, rather than an interruption of it. She was 32 years old, with dark hair cut short and close, sharp eyes that took inventory of the room in the first 2 seconds, and a quality of presence that Logan recognized immediately. She was someone who had spent years being underestimated, and had decided somewhere along the way that the best response to that was to be so clearly, undeniably excellent that the underestimation became the other person's problem. He respected that, at a distance. He stood when she entered, not out of any formal protocol, but because he'd been raised that way, and it was automatic. She didn't look at him. She moved to the head of the table, accepted a tablet from Derek Pullman without looking at him either, and scanned something on its screen. Then she looked up at the room and said, "Let's get started." Derek cleared his throat. "Victoria, this is Logan Mercer from I know who he is," she said, though her eyes had still not actually landed on Logan. "Let's talk about this deal structure first." Logan sat back down. He was not offended. He had been in many rooms. He had met CEOs who conducted entire introductory meetings without ever fully acknowledging that the other party had a name, a history, or a working brainstem. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't even always personal. He watched her. Victoria Sterling ran the meeting the way a conductor runs an orchestra. Except in this orchestra, the musicians were not expected to improvise. She moved through agenda items with surgical precision, called on specific people by name, interrupted 2 separate tangents before they went anywhere, and kept the entire room in a kind of controlled tension where everyone was paying full attention because not paying attention around Victoria Sterling, it was clear, had a cost. She was good. Logan acknowledged this without qualification. She was genuinely, impressively good at what she did. The presentation that followed was thorough, technically sophisticated, and honest about the company's challenges in a way that Logan didn't always see. Sterling Technologies had built something real, a proprietary data infrastructure platform that had genuine utility in sectors the company hadn't even fully explored yet. The core technology was defensible. The team, at the engineering level, appeared to be exceptional. The product roadmap showed both ambition and practical sequencing. But there were problems, and the presentation, to its credit, didn't hide them. The company was burning through capital faster than its revenue growth could sustain. The Series B had been delayed twice. 2 of the company's largest clients had renewed on shorter terms than before, which was the kind of thing that didn't show up in the headline numbers but told a story underneath them. And the company was at a stage where the next 12 months would determine whether it became something permanent or became a cautionary tale. $200 million would, Logan had concluded after reviewing the materials, be enough to bridge the company through the next phase. If it was paired with the right strategic partnership, and if the leadership team could get out of its own way. That last part was the variable he'd come to assess in person. He'd been watching Victoria for 20 minutes, and he was still building the picture. Then the presentation ended. Derek said, "Logan, we'd love to hear your reaction, your questions, whatever's on your mind." Logan opened his briefcase, pulled out a single yellow legal pad and a pen, and set the briefcase on the floor beside his chair. He had 4 pages of handwritten notes from his advanced review of the materials. He looked across the table at Victoria. "Before we get into the numbers," he said, "I'd like to know what you think the company looks like in 3 years if this funding round closes. Not the projections, what you actually believe." A small pause. Not long, maybe 2 seconds. But Victoria Sterling was not a woman who paused often. "Dominant position in enterprise data infrastructure," she said. "Full vertical integration in 3 target industries. 60 to 70% gross margin sustained. IPO ready. And if the funding round doesn't close?" Another pause. This one slightly harder. "That's not a scenario we're planning for." "I understand that," Logan said. "I'm asking anyway." Her eyes finally found his face, fully, for the first time. Something moved across her expression. Not quite irritation, not quite respect. Something more complicated than either. "Then we recapitalize with existing investors and move more slowly," she said. "The technology doesn't disappear, it just takes longer." That's the clean answer. It's the accurate answer. "It's the accurate answer to a slightly different question," Logan said. "My question was what you actually believe." The table was very quiet. Elaine Cho, the venture partner, had stopped writing and was watching this exchange with the stillness of someone who found it interesting. Victoria Sterling looked at Logan Mercer for a moment. Really looked at him. At the worn gray suit, at the legal pad, at the thermos ring stain on the edge of his briefcase that she could probably see from where she was sitting. Whatever calculation was happening behind her eyes resolved itself in about 3 seconds. "I believe," she said, her voice dropping into a register that was somehow more controlled, more deliberate, "that the question you should be asking is whether the technology is worth backing, not whether I've prepared the right answer." It was a deflection, but a skilled one. Logan wrote something on his legal pad. "Fair," he said. "Let me ask about the client renewal terms." "Actually," Victoria interrupted, and the word was not aggressive exactly, but it was decisive. "I'd like to address something before we continue." She looked at Derek Pullman. Some signal passed between them that Logan didn't fully decode. "We've reviewed your portfolio structure," Victoria said. She was looking at Logan now, but the look had shifted. It had cooled. "Mercer Capital is listed as a private investment vehicle. You personally hold the position." "That's correct." "Without institutional infrastructure." "Correct." "And you came here today without a formal term sheet." "I came here to have a conversation," Logan said. "Term sheets come after conversations." "Other investors who've requested meetings at this level have come with more formal materials." Logan looked at her. "I'm sure they have." "We have a process," Victoria said. "I'm sure you understand." "I do. And the process requires that we prioritize meetings with investors who are positioned to move at the speed this funding round requires." The room had gone very still. Not the productive stillness of a group thinking hard, the held breath stillness of a group that sensed something was happening that they might later need to have not witnessed. Logan set his pen down on the legal pad. He was quiet for a moment. Not flustered, not performing. Actually quiet. The way a person gets quiet when they're deciding whether something is worth their energy. "Ms. Sterling," he said, and his voice carried no particular weight or heat. It was just clear, "I've been in this room for 23 minutes. I've heard your presentation, I've asked 2 questions, and I've watched your team. I came here with serious intentions and a real number. The investment I'd have put on the table today was $200 million, structured as a lead commitment, which would have anchored your round." A beat. "Would have?" Elaine Cho said quietly. Victoria looked at him, really looked, And there was something in her expression in that moment that Logan would remember, though he wouldn't understand it fully until much later. A kind of fracture at the edge of the composure she wore so well. Something that wasn't certainty anymore. "If you'd like to continue the conversation under different terms," she said, "Derek can schedule a follow-up." Logan picked up his pen. He looked at the legal pad for a moment, and then he looked up. "I don't think I will," he said. He capped the pen. He placed it in the inside pocket of his gray suit jacket. He closed the legal pad and put it back in the briefcase. He stood up, and he looked down the table at Victoria Sterling, and he said, without rancor, without heat, with the kind of absolute plainness that is somehow more final than anger, "Thank you for your time." He extended his hand across the corner of the table. It was a plain handshake. Simple. The kind of gesture a person offers to close a meeting with basic human dignity. His hand sat there in the space between them for 2 full seconds. Victoria Sterling turned away. She picked up the tablet Derek had given her and looked at the screen. "Derek will see you out," she said. Logan Mercer lowered his hand. He picked up his briefcase. He looked at the room, at Derek, who was examining the carpet, at Elaine Cho, who was looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, at Richard Hausmann, who had gone very still, at the other 4 people at the table who were each, in their own way, pretending to be somewhere else. "Good luck with the round," Logan said. He walked to the door and opened it and stepped into the corridor, and the door closed behind him with a soft, heavy click. In the elevator going down, he took out his phone and looked at the time. 10:41. He had an hour and 19 minutes left on the parking garage ticket. He thought about calling his assistant, Marcus. He thought about calling the office. He thought about whether there was anything else in his afternoon that needed to move. He thought about the fracture he'd seen in Victoria Sterling's expression, that half-second where the composure had slipped, and he wondered whether she was the kind of person who noticed those moments in herself, or whether she'd already reinterpreted what had just happened into something more comfortable. He thought about Nora and whether Mrs. Callahan had returned the science project yet. He thought, $200 million. He thought, some lessons are expensive. The elevator hit the lobby. Logan Mercer walked through it, pushed through the glass door into the Manhattan morning, and turned his collar up against a wind coming off the river, and walked back toward the parking garage 3 blocks east. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He looked at the screen. It was Marcus. He answered on the second ring. "How'd it go?" Marcus asked. Marcus had been with Logan for 7 years. He had a talent for asking questions with exactly the right level of neutrality. Logan was quiet for a moment. A cab slid past, horn going, someone in the back seat looking at a phone. "Pull the commitment," Logan said. A brief silence. "The whole position?" "The whole position." "Okay." Marcus didn't ask why. This was one of the things Logan valued about him. "Anything else?" "Send the standard withdrawal notice, keep it clean, no editorial." "Done. How are you getting back?" "I'm parked on 54th. I'll be on the road in 5 minutes." "Your 3 o'clock is still on. Rothenberg called to confirm." "That's fine." "You okay?" Logan thought about a gray conference room on the 35th floor and a woman who was genuinely excellent at what she did and had still, in one clean motion, thrown away something enormous. He thought about the hand he'd extended that sat there for 2 seconds and found nothing waiting on the other side. "Yeah," he said, "I'm fine." He put the phone in his pocket and kept walking, and the city moved around him the way it always did, loud and indifferent and full of people who had no idea what had just happened 4 blocks west on the 35th floor of a building they probably walked past every day. What? The thing about the way Logan Mercer operated was that almost nobody knew how he operated. This was intentional, and it had taken years to build, and it was worth more to him than any single deal. He had started Mercer Capital in his late 20s with money he'd made as a junior analyst at a mid-sized private equity firm, parlayed over 4 years of brutal 18-hour days and a few early calls that turned out to be right in ways nobody had anticipated. By 30, he had a small office in Midtown and 3 employees. By 32, after a set of investments in infrastructure technology that the market had largely ignored, he had enough capital under management that the math stopped feeling real. By 35, the fund was structured through a network of holding companies and SPVs that made it genuinely difficult to trace the full scale of what he controlled. He had done this partly for strategic reasons. A visible investor attracts noise, noise attracts imitators, imitators erode the advantage that comes from moving quietly, and partly because he simply preferred it. He had watched people he respected get swallowed by the performance of wealth, the speaking engagements, and the profile pieces, and the panel seats at conferences, and the slow, gradual conversion from a person who thought about things into a person who talked about what they thought about things. He had seen it happen so often and so completely that he had decided at some point that he couldn't precisely identify that he would structure his life to make it difficult. He drove the old Volvo. He lived in a house in Westchester that was comfortable but not ostentatious, the kind of house that a successful doctor might own, not the kind that appeared in architectural magazines. He sent Nora to the public school 3 blocks away because it was a good school and because he believed, with a conviction he couldn't entirely explain, that it mattered where a kid grew up relative to the world as it actually existed. He had one close friend, a man named Ben Archer, who ran a restaurant in Brooklyn and had known Logan since they were both broke and 24 and sharing a terrible apartment in Astoria. He had 2 business colleagues he genuinely trusted, Marcus, his assistant, and effectively his chief of staff, and a woman named Priya Subramaniam, who managed his portfolio operations. Everyone else existed at a professional distance that Logan maintained with the kind of practiced friendliness that kept doors open without letting anyone in. Claire had been the exception to all of it. Claire had been the person who could walk into the careful architecture of Logan's reserved inner life and rearrange things simply by being present. She had been the one who understood, without needing it explained, why Logan drove the old car and lived in the modest house. Not because he was performing simplicity, but because those were the conditions under which he could think clearly, and thinking clearly was the thing he cared most about preserving. She had matched him in this, in her own way. Claire had been a high school biology teacher who read academic papers for fun and argued about them with genuine heat, and the combination of intellectual seriousness and complete disinterest in prestige had been the first thing that had made Logan feel in his adult life like he'd met someone of his own kind. She had died of an aggressive cancer when Nora was 2 years old and Logan was 30. He had spent the 6 months of her illness doing what he always did when something was wrong. He had worked harder. Not to avoid grief exactly, or maybe exactly that, but also because working gave him the illusion of control in a situation where there was none, and the illusion was better than the alternative. After she died, he had taken 3 weeks off and spent them at his parents' house in Pittsburgh, where his mother had fed him too much food, and his father had said very little, and Nora had learned to pull herself up on the living room furniture and stand briefly on her own 2 feet, which was a development so ordinary and so enormous that Logan had cried in the bathroom twice about it. Then he had gone back to work, and he had kept going, and he had built the kind of life that a man builds when what he's really doing is ensuring that he is never without something necessary to do. Nora was the bright, difficult, non-negotiable center of everything. She was 8 now, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's tendency to get very quiet when she was thinking hard. She liked horses, prime numbers, and a specific brand of fruit snacks that she considered non-negotiable. She asked questions that Logan could not always answer, and she always knew when he was evading, and she had recently begun saying, with an 8-year-old's devastating precision, "Dad, that's not what I asked." He was picking her up at 4. The thought of it, sitting in the parking garage collecting his car, was the cleanest thing in his afternoon. He was on the FDR drive, heading north, when his phone rang through the car speakers. He checked the display. Elaine Cho. He let it ring twice, then picked up. "Logan?" Her voice was measured. She was a careful speaker, Elaine. Everything calibrated. "Elaine, I heard you're withdrawing. Word travels fast. The walls in that building are thin in the right directions." A pause. "For what it's worth, that was not an outcome anyone in that room was expecting." "Including me," Logan said. "What happened in there?" She stopped. Started again. "I want you to know it doesn't reflect how we view this process." Logan looked at the river moving alongside the highway, flat and gray in the morning light. "Elaine," he said, "it doesn't matter how you view the process. What happened in that room is what happened. I'm not interested in a debrief. The technology is genuinely strong. I agree with you. The round needs you. I understand that. Logan, the answer is no, he said, and there was no anger in it, just a closed door. If the situation changes substantially, Marcus knows how to reach me. Otherwise, good luck with the rest of it. He hung up. He drove north along the river. A barge moved slowly south on the water. He watched it for a moment, then looked back at the road. He thought about the way Victoria Sterling had looked at him, not the dismissal at the end. Before that. In the middle of the meeting, when he'd pushed her on the real answer, the moment when she'd had to decide whether to respect the question or deflect it, and she'd deflected it, and then something in her expression had shifted in a way that made him think she knew she'd deflected it, knew it had been the wrong choice, and had made it anyway. He had met a lot of people like that. People who were brilliant and capable and badly served by the specific kind of arrogance that had calcified around them so gradually that it had become indistinguishable from character. He didn't hate them. He had, at various points in his own life, been adjacent to that quality in himself. The certainty that the quality of your own thinking entitled you to shortcut the quality of your attention to other people. The difference, he thought, was whether you noticed it. He had noticed it in himself at 28, in a meeting not unlike today's, a meeting where he had dismissed someone based on their appearance and their hesitance, and turned out to be completely wrong, and lost a significant amount of money, and sat in his office afterward for a long time thinking about what it had cost him, and why. He had never made that exact mistake again. Victoria Sterling was excellent at what she did. She had built something real and defended it against real opposition, and done it from a position that afforded her no margin for error. He knew that. He had researched it. He respected it without reservation. He also knew that what she had done in that room was the kind of thing that compounded. Errors of judgment rarely traveled alone. They moved in clusters, feeding each other, and the longer you went without correcting the underlying assumption, the more expensive the correction eventually became. He was not happy about this. He had not left that room feeling like he'd won something. He'd left feeling the specific deflation of having come somewhere with a real intention, and walked away empty-handed because of something that had nothing to do with the merit of anything. He took the exit for 95 and headed toward Westchester, and thought about the 3 o'clock meeting with Rothenberg, and whether Nora would want to stop for dinner on the way home or go straight back to finish her project on the water cycle. He turned the radio on. The sports host was still talking about the basketball team with no shot at the playoffs. Still optimistic. Logan turned it up. By that evening, Marcus had sent the formal withdrawal notice. Standard language, no explanation beyond the customary, "We are no longer pursuing this opportunity at this time." Clean and final, and, to the person receiving it, completely uninterpretable. Victoria Sterling would not know, reading it, whether Logan Mercer had found a problem in the financials, had cold feet, had gone to a competitor, or had simply changed his mind for private reasons. The withdrawal notice offered none of that. It was the equivalent of a door closing. No note slipped under it, no explanation from the other side. This was also intentional. What happened next was not something Logan planned exactly. He had not sent the withdrawal notice expecting any particular cascade. He had simply made a decision and recorded it, the way he always did. But money in a funding round operates like a weight-bearing wall. When the right piece shifts, things begin to settle in ways that weren't visible before. By the following morning, one of the co-investors who had been waiting on Logan's lead before finalizing their own position put their commitment on hold. By noon, a second investor who had been loosely involved asked for an extension on the diligence timeline. By afternoon, Sterling Technologies' investor relations team was fielding calls they had not expected to field for another 3 weeks. None of this was Logan's doing, specifically. He had simply stopped. But in a funding round at the stage Sterling Technologies was in, fragile, over-leveraged, running on confidence as much as capital, sometimes stopping was enough. The wheel had already begun to turn. Logan was in Westchester, sitting at the kitchen table helping Nora with her water cycle project. When his phone lit up with a news alert, he didn't open until much later. "Dad," Nora said, "you're not listening." "I am," he said. "What did I just say?" "You were explaining evaporation." She looked at him. "I was explaining condensation." "Right." He put the phone face down on the table. "Start again." She sighed heavily, the way only an 8-year-old can. With her whole body, like disappointment was a physical condition. Okay, she said. So, the water goes up because of evaporation, he offered. Because of evaporation, she said with tremendous patience. And then it gets cold at the top. And then condensation. Condensation. And then it falls. Precipitation. And then, she said, pointing at him with her pencil, it starts all over again. The cycle, Logan said. The cycle, Nora said. Things don't just stop, they keep going. She looked at her diagram, satisfied. Logan looked at her. Yeah, he said, they do. Outside, the spring evening was going dark, and the city was 30 miles south, and somewhere in a glass tower on the 35th floor, a wheel was turning that Victoria Sterling had not yet fully heard. The withdrawal notice arrived in Victoria's inbox at 6:47 in the evening, while she was still in the building. She read it twice. Then she set her tablet face down on the desk and looked out the window at the city going dark below her, and she was quiet for a long time. Derek Pullman was still in the office. He was always still in the office when she was. And he appeared in her doorway about 4 minutes later with the careful expression of a man delivering news he would have preferred to deliver differently. You saw it, he said. I saw it. It's standard language. We don't know yet what... I know what it means, Derek. He came into the office and sat in the chair across from her desk. This was the chair she kept for conversations that required sitting, which she reserved for conversations that were actually difficult rather than just complicated. The fact that he sat without being asked meant he already understood which kind this was. Elaine called me, he said. She spoke to him on his way back. He chose his next word with visible care. Interested in further dialogue. What did she say to him? She made the case for the technology. He agreed with her. And? Derek was quiet for a second. He said the answer was no. Victoria looked at the withdrawal notice on the face-down tablet. She knew exactly what was in it. She had drafted versions of that same letter herself on behalf of her company when they were the ones withdrawing. She knew how much nothing was in it. No reasoning, no door left open, no trail to follow back. Just a closed gate with a lock she didn't have a key to. Who else has he talked to? She asked. We don't know. Marcus, his assistant, sent the notice directly to our IR team. That's the only contact we've had. Find out what you can, she said. Not through back channel. Through proper diligence. I want to understand his portfolio, his pattern, what he's done before when he's pulled out of a round. Okay? Derek stood. He paused at the door. Victoria. She looked at him. I just want to say... He stopped. Started again. Today was a difficult meeting. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that didn't invite the rest of the sentence. Good night, Derek, she said. He left. She sat in her office for another 40 minutes after that, which was longer than she normally allowed herself to sit still without doing anything that counted as work. Outside, the city lit itself up the way it always did. Indifferent, inexhaustible, deeply uninterested in the specific failures of any single person moving through it. She thought about Logan Mercer's hand, extended across the corner of the conference table. She thought about the 2 seconds she had spent looking at it before turning away. She thought about the fact that she had done it deliberately, had made the choice consciously, and had not, in the room, in the moment, felt any doubt about it. She felt doubt about it now, not the choking, obvious kind. More like a small stone had settled somewhere in her chest, and she could feel its weight when she breathed. And she was not yet ready to fully name what it was. She told herself it was just business. She told herself that one investor pulling out of a round, even a significant one, was not the end of the story. She had rebuilt before. She had been told no before, in much harder rooms than that one, by people with much less decency than Logan Mercer had shown when he closed his briefcase and wished her luck. She drove herself home. She drove everywhere herself, had modified her vehicle the year she turned 26 and decided she was done waiting for other people to take her places. And she made a bowl of pasta and ate it standing in her kitchen because she rarely ate at the table when she was alone. And she went to bed at 11:15 and lay there looking at the ceiling for a long time before she slept. She did not think about the stone in her chest. She was very good at not thinking about things. The thing Victoria Sterling had built was real. This deserved to be said plainly because what came next had a way of obscuring it. She had founded Sterling Technologies at 26, 6 years after a car accident on the Palisades Parkway that had left her paralyzed from the waist down at 20. She had spent the year of her recovery doing three things: physical therapy, reading every book about technology infrastructure she could get her hands on, and thinking very carefully about what she was going to do with the rest of her life, now that the life she had planned was no longer the life available to her. She had studied computer science at Columbia before the accident. She had been good at it, not in the prodigy sense, but in the disciplined, thorough sense that turned out to be more durable. She had an instinct for systems, for understanding how things connected beneath the surface, for seeing where the load-bearing structures were and where they were decorative. She had taken that instinct and applied it, in the years after her recovery, to building a company from nothing in an industry that treated her, initially, as a curiosity. The wheelchair made her visible in a way she hadn't asked for. Every meeting in those early years had a quality of performance to it. She could feel people deciding whether to take her seriously, performing the calculation in real time, and she had learned to interrupt that calculation by being, simply and immediately, the most prepared and precise person in the room. It had worked. It had cost her things she didn't always acknowledge. A quality of ease in social spaces that she'd never fully reclaimed, a tendency to convert every interaction into a performance of competence, a difficulty with the specific vulnerability of being wrong. But it had worked. By 29, Sterling Technologies had 50 employees and its first major enterprise client. By 31, 200 employees and a revenue line that was beginning to mean something. By 32, standing in the boardroom she'd had designed to her own specifications on the 35th floor of a building she did not yet own but planned to. She had built something that belonged in the conversation about the most significant infrastructure plays of the decade. The funding challenge was real, but it was not existential. Not yet. That distinction, not yet, would prove to be the hinge everything turned on. 3 days after Logan's withdrawal, a man named Patterson from Grayfield Capital called Derek's cell phone at 8 in the morning and asked for a quiet conversation about the round's current status. Patterson was one of 3 co-investors who had been conditional on the lead commitment. His tone was professional, and his questions were reasonable, and every single one of them was a version of the same question: how stable is this right now? Derek brought the call summary to Victoria at 9. She read it. Her face did not change. "Schedule a call with Patterson directly," she said. "This week. I'll handle it." "He's asking about the lead position." "I know what he's asking. Do we have a replacement lead?" She looked at Derek. "We're working on it." This was not entirely true. They had 3 names on a short list of potential replacement leads, and of those 3 names, one had already informally declined. One was in the middle of a complex deal that would absorb their attention for at least 60 days. And one was a firm that Victoria had complicated history with, the kind of history that made every conversation about money also a conversation about something else. She was working on it. That much was accurate. She called Patterson herself that Thursday and spent 45 minutes on the phone with him, which was 45 minutes of the most careful, precise, emotionally calibrated business conversation she had delivered in recent memory. By the end of it, Patterson had agreed to extend his commitment window by 30 days. She got off the call and sat for a moment. 30 days was not much. 30 days was something. Marcus, Logan's assistant, still had not returned any of Derek's calls. The withdrawal notice remained the last communication from Mercer Capital. Elaine Cho had made 2 more attempts to reach Logan, both of which she reported back to Derek as politely declined. Not rude, just closed. It was Priya, not Logan's Priya, but Sterling Technologies' head of investor relations, a woman named Priya Okafor, who had been with the company for 4 years and had an instinct for reading the temperature of a room from across a city, who first brought Logan's full profile to Victoria's desk. She set a printed brief on the desk one Tuesday morning without comment, and Victoria looked at the cover page, and the cover page said, Mercer, Logan A., Investment History and Portfolio Summary, and there were 11 pages after it. Victoria read all 11 pages. Then she read them again. By the 3rd page, she understood that she had made a significant error. By the 7th page, she understood the full scale of it. By the 11th page, She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and said nothing for long enough that Priya, still sitting across from her, thought about whether to leave. "How long have you had this?" Victoria asked. "I pulled it together Monday night," Priya said, "after Elaine's second call didn't go through." "Why didn't we have this before the meeting?" Priya was quiet for a moment. "Because he wasn't flagged as a priority contact in the initial screening. His name came to us through a secondary referral, and the fund structure it's designed to not be easy to find." "His fund controls how much?" Priya looked at the brief. "Conservatively, $4.3 billion in capital under active management. With the holding companies and SPVs factored in, the estimated total is closer to 6. Victoria looked at the cover page again. Logan Mercer. The gray suit, the old briefcase, the thermos ring on the leather. The hand extended across the conference table that she had turned away from. She thought about how she had looked at that hand and thought, "This man is not worth my time." She thought, $6 billion. She thought then about something harder. Not the number. The number was devastating enough on its own. But the thing underneath the number. The fact that she had looked at a person and made a calculation based on what she could see on the surface and had been completely, profoundly wrong, not just about his financial position, but about what kind of person he was. Because the 11 pages in front of her told a story. Mercer Capital did not invest in companies. It invested in people. Every major position in Logan's portfolio had been held for more than 5 years. Every company he'd backed had been led by someone who had been, at the time of the investment, operating outside the mainstream of their industry. Overlooked, undercapitalized, moving differently than the crowd. He had backed a logistics startup run by a former long-haul trucker at a time when logistics startups were not fashionable. He had backed a materials science company out of a state university in Ohio that no one on the East Coast had paid attention to. He had, in one case, written a check to a 24-year-old woman with no institutional background who had a genuine insight about something in biotech that nobody else saw, and he had held that position for 6 years and watched it become something that changed the industry. He did not invest in spectacle. He invested in things that were real. Sterling Technologies was real. She knew it was real. She had built it with 7 years of her life, and she had sent the person who was most qualified to see that. The person who had come specifically to see it, who had asked the right questions and showed up with the right number. She had sent him out of the room without shaking his hand. "Get me a direct line to Mercer Capital," Victoria said. Priya nodded. "Marcus Dunn is his point of contact. I have his number." "Not Marcus," Victoria said. "Logan directly, whatever it takes." "I'll try. His direct contact isn't listed." "Find it." Priya found it. It took her until the following afternoon through a chain of contacts that went Priya to a portfolio lawyer she knew, the lawyer to a mutual acquaintance who had worked with Logan in the early days, the acquaintance to Logan's cell number. She texted the number to Victoria at 3:22 on a Wednesday. Victoria looked at it for a long time. Then she called. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Logan's voicemail message was short and impersonal. His name, a request to leave a message. "This is Victoria Sterling," she said, and was surprised to hear that her own voice sounded slightly different than she expected, tighter, more controlled than usual, which meant she was more nervous than she had acknowledged. "I'd like the opportunity to speak with you directly. I think we left things in a place that didn't reflect—" She stopped, started again. "I'd like to speak with you. You have this number now. I'd appreciate a call back." She hung up. He did not call back that day. He did not call back the following day. She checked her phone more often than she had in years, which was its own kind of information about her state of mind. On the same Wednesday that Victoria was waiting for a call that didn't come, Logan was in a school gymnasium in Westchester, watching Nora run a relay race in a gym class parent observation day that he had been invited to 3 weeks earlier and had rescheduled his entire afternoon to attend. Nora ran with the intense, slightly chaotic determination of a child who had not yet fully coordinated effort with technique. She pumped her arms more than was probably necessary. She ran with her face forward and her eyes fixed on the far cone with a focus that Logan found, honestly, moving. The absolute commitment of a child to a task that was entirely, joyfully, unambiguously real. She came in second in her heat, which she told him afterward was the same as winning except one person was faster, a philosophy Logan found he had no problem with. You looked good out there, he told her. My baton pass was bad, she said. Tommy almost dropped it. Tommy's grip is his own problem. Dad, she gave him a look. We're a team. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. You're right. They stopped at a diner on the way home, a specific diner, the one on Maple Avenue with the vinyl booth seats and the pie rotating in a case by the register. Nora ordered chocolate milk and a grilled cheese and ate half the pickle that came with it before pushing the other half toward Logan, which was their standing arrangement. Did anything happen today? She asked. At work? Why? She shrugged, eyes on her sandwich. You have the quiet face. He looked at her. What quiet face? The one where you're thinking about something but you're not going to say what it is. She took a bite, chewed. You've had it for a few days. He was quiet for a moment, then, someone called me today that I wasn't expecting. Who? Someone from work. Nora considered this. A good someone or a bad someone? He thought about it honestly, the way she always deserved. I don't know yet, he said. Are you going to call them back? I haven't decided. She nodded, very seriously. Sometimes, she said, I don't call people back from class when they say something mean, but sometimes I do. What makes the difference? Whether they actually meant it or whether they were just, she searched for the word, being automatic. Logan looked at his daughter, 8 years old and eating half a pickle in a diner in Westchester. Being automatic, he repeated, like they didn't think about it. They just did the thing people do. She picked up the other half of the pickle. Those people sometimes turn out to be okay if you give them another chance, but you have to decide if you want to spend the energy. When did you figure that out? Mrs. Callahan says it, she said, but I think she's right. He drove home thinking about the distinction, whether Victoria Sterling had been being automatic, whether the question even mattered. He thought about the fracture he'd seen behind her eyes in that conference room, the half-second where something cracked. He thought about the 11-page brief that Priya Okafor had assembled. He knew about it because Priya had used a mutual contact to reach his cell number, and the chain of contacts was not as invisible as Victoria had probably assumed. He thought about the voicemail. Her voice had been different than it had been in the boardroom. Not smaller, exactly, just less armored. He did not call back that night. He made Nora's lunch for the next day, turkey sandwich, carrots, the specific brand of fruit snacks, and set it in the refrigerator and read 3 pages of a novel he had been working through for 6 weeks, and fell asleep. By Friday, the information landscape had shifted in a way that nobody inside Sterling Technologies had fully anticipated. It started small. A finance blog that covered Series B rounds in the mid-market tech space published a brief item. Sources indicate Mercer Capital has withdrawn from Sterling Technologies' funding round. Lead position now unclear. The item was 2 paragraphs and cited no named sources, and under normal circumstances it would have passed unnoticed into the background radiation of industry gossip. But the timing was wrong, and the space it occupied was wrong, and it got picked up. By Saturday morning, a business wire service had run a short item of its own, this one with a slightly different angle. Not just that Mercer had withdrawn, but that the withdrawal had caused movement among other investors. Conditional commitments on hold, timeline questions, the kind of language that in the coverage of a funding round worked like smoke signals, specific enough to be alarming, vague enough to mean the situation was still in motion. Victoria read the Saturday item in her apartment at 6 in the morning, the way she read everything she didn't want to read. Early, before the day had gathered enough momentum to make the bad news part of something larger, when it could still be contained to a quiet room and a cup of coffee. She texted Derek, "You see the Business Wire item?" He texted back 12 minutes later. She'd woken him, she knew, and she was not sorry. "Yes, we need a PR response by Monday." She typed back, "Working on it." She was not, in that moment, working on it. She was sitting with her coffee going cold and looking at the coverage that had already accumulated on her phone, and she was doing something she rarely allowed herself to do. She was counting the cost of a specific moment, running the numbers backward from the present, the wire item, the conditional holds, Patterson's 30-day extension, Elaine's 2 declined calls, Derek's careful expression, the empty withdrawal notice, the hand across the table. The hand across the table. $200 million. The lead position. The 30-day clock. All of it traceable, in a straight line, to the 2 seconds she had looked at a hand that was extended in basic human decency and turned away from it. She put the coffee down. She picked up her phone and looked at Logan Mercer's number. Still there from the Wednesday call, still waiting, and she typed a text message. She spent 12 minutes writing it, which was longer than she normally spent on any communication that wasn't a formal document. Mr. Mercer, I understand you have no obligation to respond, and I'm not reaching out about the funding round. I'm reaching out because I owe you an apology that I didn't offer in that conference room, and I think you deserve to hear it directly. What I did was wrong, not strategically, wrong. I know the difference, even if my behavior that day didn't show it. V. Sterling. She read it twice. She sent it. She put the phone face down on the counter and made herself a second cup of coffee, and did not look at the phone again for 11 minutes, which was, for her, a remarkable act of restraint. When she picked it up, there was no response. She hadn't expected one. Not really. But the stone in her chest, the one she'd been carrying since Tuesday when she'd read the 11 pages and understood the full weight of her mistake, felt, fractionally, less heavy. Not gone. Not even close to gone. Just slightly less. Outside, Manhattan was waking up on a Saturday morning, gray and loud and entirely indifferent to the question of what she deserved. She put the phone in her pocket and went to work. Logan read the text message on a Saturday afternoon while standing in the backyard with a rake he hadn't used yet, doing the thing he sometimes did when he needed to think, which was hold a tool and not use it, and look at the yard and let whatever needed to settle, settle. He read it twice. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and raked leaves for 20 minutes. Nora was at a friend's house until 4. The yard needed the work. The air was cold and clean and carried the smell of something burning somewhere in the neighborhood. A fireplace, probably. Someone a few houses down who had the same instinct about the first real autumn Saturday. He worked the rake in long strokes and thought about the text and thought about the distinction Nora had made at the diner, whether a person was being automatic or whether they actually meant the thing they did. What I did was wrong, not strategically. Wrong. I know the difference. He stood there with the rake and thought about that sentence for a while. It was a specific thing to say. Most apologies, the professional kind, the kind exchanged between people in business who needed to preserve a relationship, did not make that distinction. They apologized for outcomes. They apologized for the disruption, for the miscommunication, for the fact that things had not gone as intended. They did not apologize for the specific moral content of a choice. Victoria Sterling had apologized for the moral content of a choice. He was not sure what to do with that. He finished the leaves, he washed his hands at the kitchen sink, he made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and took out his phone and looked at the message again, and then he put the phone down and looked out the window at the yard he'd just raked. He did not respond that day. He thought about it Sunday morning and didn't respond. He thought about it Sunday evening while Nora was doing homework at the kitchen table, and she looked up at him at one point and said, without looking up from her worksheet, "You still have the quiet face." "I'm aware," he said. "Is it the same person?" "Yes." "Did they mean it?" He thought about a specific sentence. Not strategically. Wrong. I know the difference. "I think so," he said. Nora nodded and went back to her worksheet. "Then you probably should." He looked at her. "Should what?" "Call them back." She erased something. "You already know you're going to. You're just taking a long time getting there." He was quiet. "How do you know that?" She looked up. "Because you still have the rake out," she said, and pointed out the window at the tool he'd left leaning against the back fence. "You always put stuff away when you're done thinking about something." He looked at the rake through the window. She was right. He hadn't put it away. He went back inside after Nora went to bed and typed, "I got your message. I'm not interested in reopening the conversation about the round, but I'm willing to talk, if the apology is the only thing on the agenda." He sent it before he could rewrite it. 3 minutes later, "It is. Thank you." They met the following Wednesday at a coffee shop in Midtown that was not near Sterling Technologies' office. and was not near anything Logan was associated with. A neutral block, a place that belonged to neither of them. Victoria had suggested it. Logan had agreed. He arrived first. He ordered a plain coffee and sat at a corner table and watched the door. She came in at exactly the time they'd agreed, which he noted. Her chair moved through the space between tables with a practiced efficiency that suggested she'd long since stopped thinking about it. She was wearing a dark coat and no corporate armor, no lanyard, no tablet, none of the infrastructure that surrounded her in the boardroom. She looked, he thought, like a person rather than a position. She saw him, and he watched her face do something careful, not quite compose itself, because it was already composed, but settle, like she'd been braced for something and had decided, somewhere between the door and the table, to unclench. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Sure." She ordered a coffee from the server who appeared, and they were quiet until it arrived. It was the kind of quiet that had weight to it, not hostile, not comfortable, just honest about what it was. "I meant what I said in the text," she said. "I know. I'm not going to try to, She stopped. "I was going to say I'm not going to try to explain it, but that's not entirely true. I have an explanation. I just don't think the explanation is an excuse." "Okay," Logan said. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. It was cold outside, and she'd come in from it and hadn't fully warmed. "When you walked into that room," she said, "I made a judgment. Based on the suit, the briefcase, the way you looked. I decided in the first 10 seconds that you were someone's assistant, or someone who'd been given a meeting he hadn't earned, and I proceeded from that judgment." "I know," Logan said again. "I've been trying to figure out," she said, and her voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but less controlled, more unedited, when that became automatic for me. The thing of looking at someone and just sorting, fast, without actually seeing. Logan looked at her. "And?" "I think it's been a long time," she said. "I think I got so used to defending myself against that exact thing being done to me, people looking at me and sorting fast and deciding what I was, that I built the same mechanism, pointed outward." He was quiet for a moment. "That's an honest thing to say." "It's a true thing," she said. Honest would have been saying it in that conference room instead of in a coffee shop 2 weeks later after everything fell apart. He drank his coffee. The shop was warm and busy in the way of a Wednesday mid-morning. Laptops and conversations, and someone near the window reading an actual paper newspaper, which Logan found obscurely reassuring. "I'm not going to reopen the investment conversation," he said. "I know. That's not what this is. I understand." She looked at him directly. "I'm not here for the money. I know that sounds—" She made a small gesture. "I know how it sounds, given everything, but I'm not." "Then what are you here for?" She thought about it, and he could see her thinking, which was different from the boardroom where everything had been instant and certain and closed. "I think I'm here," she said slowly, "because I want to know that I'm capable of doing this correctly. Of sitting in front of someone I treated badly and actually saying the thing without an angle, without it being about what comes next." She looked down at her coffee. "I'm not great at that." "No," Logan said. "You're not." She looked up. Something in his directness surprised her. She hadn't expected him to confirm it so plainly, and the surprise showed. "But you knew that about yourself," he said, "which is further along than a lot of people get." She was quiet. He looked at his coffee. "I accept the apology," he said, "for what that's worth." Something moved across her face. Not relief exactly, more like something that had been held at a particular tension released a fraction. "Thank you," she said. They sat for a few minutes more, talking in the way people talk when the primary thing has been said, and they're both figuring out what, if anything, comes after it. He asked about the company, not about the round, about the technology itself, what problem it was actually solving, where the hardest engineering challenges were. She talked about it the way she hadn't in the conference room, with the direct enthusiasm of someone who actually loved the technical specifics, who could spend 40 minutes on a single infrastructure problem and not notice the time passing. He listened. He asked a question about the data architecture that was specific enough that she paused and looked at him differently. The way a person looks at someone who turns out to understand the thing you built. "You actually read the technical docs," she said. "I read everything," he said. "That's the whole job." She shook her head slightly, not dismissively, something more like self-recrimination. "I assumed you hadn't." "I know." Another silence. "The round," she said, and then stopped. I'm not asking. I just want to say that I understand what I cost the company, and I'm going to fix it. Not because I owe you that, but because the people who work for me deserve a CEO who doesn't make that kind of error." Logan nodded. He believed her. He wasn't sure why, except that it had the texture of something true rather than something constructed. They left the coffee shop 20 minutes later, separately, in different directions. Logan walked back toward the parking garage and thought that something had shifted in a way he couldn't entirely define. Not the funding, not the business. Something smaller and less immediately useful than either of those things. He thought about what his daughter had said about automatic versus meant. He thought Victoria Sterling had meant it. He didn't know yet what that was worth, but he was paying attention. The thing about a funding round in trouble is that it doesn't fail all at once. It fails the way a building develops a crack, slowly, from specific points of stress, the damage spreading through the structure at its own pace while the surface holds and everyone inside keeps working and the facade from the outside looks intact. Sterling Technologies held the facade for 10 days after the Saturday Wire item. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, a former senior engineer named Raymond Chu gave an interview to a technology trade publication. Raymond Chu had left Sterling Technologies 8 months earlier. He had given no public statements about his departure. His LinkedIn page described his time at the company in neutral professional language, led infrastructure development team, drove core platform architecture, the kind of language that said nothing and therefore said everything. He had, in the 8 months since leaving, started a small consulting practice and kept his head down. The interview lasted an hour. The publication released it in 3 parts over 2 days. The first part covered the technical culture. Raymond was measured, precise, careful to acknowledge that the technology itself was strong. He talked about the team, the engineers, the people doing the actual work, with genuine respect. The second part covered the leadership culture. There was a word that got used internally, Raymond said. Not officially, just in the way people talked when they were having honest conversations. The word was cost. He paused in the recording. As in, what's the cost of raising this to Victoria's attention? What's the cost of being the person who says the timeline isn't realistic? What's the cost of being in the room when she decides someone isn't at her level? And you start making decisions based on that calculation instead of based on what's actually right for the company. That's when you know the culture has a problem. The third part was worse. A specific incident. A junior analyst named, the publication used her first name only at her request, named Dana, who had flagged a discrepancy in a client contract renewal. Not a fraud, not a cover-up, just a contractual language issue that needed to be corrected before it created a larger problem. Dana had brought it up in a team meeting where Victoria was present. Victoria told her, Raymond said, to learn how to read a room before she raised issues at the wrong level, in front of 8 other people. He paused. Dana was 24. She was right about the contract, and she quit 3 weeks later. The interview went wide. The trade publication piece got picked up by 3 larger outlets by Wednesday morning. The language about cost, what's the cost of speaking up, what's the cost of being seen, became a shorthand that appeared in 2 separate editorial pieces by Thursday. Victoria read every word of all of it. She read Raymond Chu's account in her office at 6:30 in the morning, before anyone else was in the building, with her door closed and the lights on low, and she sat with it in a way she had not sat with press before. Her usual instinct with negative coverage was to move immediately. PR response, counter-narrative, interview requests. She had always believed that silence was surrender and that the right answer to a story you disagreed with was to produce a better story. She did not move immediately this time. She sat with the account of Dana, the 24-year-old analyst who had been right about the contract and been told, in front of 8 people, to learn how to read a room. Victoria remembered that meeting. She did not remember Dana specifically, which was its own form of information, that she had said something that had ended a person's time at the company and had not retained the person's face. But she remembered the meeting. She remembered the particular impatience of that morning, the three things she was tracking simultaneously while the team was going through the contract review, the specific irritation of what had felt in that moment like someone derailing the agenda with a technicality. She remembered thinking, this is not the time. She did not remember thinking, this person is right. She picked up her phone and called Derek. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant he'd already read it. I know, she said, before he could speak. The PR team is drafting a response, he said. They want to talk to you by 8. Tell them to hold. Victoria, tell them to hold until I decide what the response actually is. She looked out the window at the city below. Raymond Chu, do we have a relationship with him still? Any relationship? Not formal. I think he and Marcus Kim still talk socially. Find out if he'd take a call from me. Derek was quiet for a moment. You want to call him directly? I want to know if he'd take the call. There's a difference. Another pause. Okay, I'll ask. And Dana, she said. The analyst he mentioned, first name only in the piece. Can we identify her? Probably, the team would know. Quietly. Don't make it. I'm not trying to find her to. She stopped. I just want to know if she's all right. Derek said nothing for a moment. I'll look into it, he said carefully. She hung up and sat in her office as the building began to fill around her, the day assembling itself in the hallway sounds of people arriving, the coffee machine running, the specific low hum of a company waking up and not yet knowing how bad the morning was. She thought about Raymond Chu saying the word cost. What's the cost of speaking up? What's the cost of being visible? She had spent her entire career paying that cost on behalf of herself. The cost of being seen, being visible, being in rooms she was not expected to inhabit. She had paid it and built something real on the back of paying it. And she had created an environment where the people around her were calculating the same cost, in reverse, every single day. The irony of it was so clean and so brutal that she sat with it for a long time without trying to resolve it. The stock declined 4% on Thursday. It was not catastrophic. In isolation, it was the kind of movement a company could absorb. But it followed 2 days of coverage that had tilted the story from funding round in question to leadership culture under scrutiny, which were two different stories with two different gravitational effects on investor confidence. Elaine Cho called Victoria directly that Thursday afternoon. I need to be honest with you, Elaine said, and her voice had lost the diplomatic layering that usually covered her directness. Because I think you deserve honesty right now more than you deserve management. Go ahead, Victoria said. The Chu interview changed the shape of the conversation. Before, this was about one investor pulling out and the round needing to reset. That's recoverable. But now there are board members asking questions that they weren't asking last week, about culture, about whether the leadership issues are structural. And what are you telling them? I'm telling them that I don't have enough information to answer that. A pause. But I'm also telling them that the way this gets handled in the next 2 weeks will tell us more than anything that's already happened. Meaning how you respond to the Chu piece, whether you address it or deflect it. Whether the company looks like one that's capable of honest self-examination or one that's going to litigate every negative story. Elaine paused. The board meets in 2 weeks. There are 3 members who are asking questions I would not have predicted 3 weeks ago. Victoria absorbed this. Who? Hausmann, Reyes. Probably Park, though she hasn't said anything directly. These were 3 of the company's 7 board members. Hausmann, she had known, was risk-averse. He'd been skeptical at the last 2 board meetings about the funding timeline. Reyes was less predictable, which made him more worrying. Park was the member she'd always believed was most aligned with her vision. 2 weeks, Victoria said. 2 weeks, Elaine confirmed. After the call, Victoria sat for a long time without moving. The office was quieter now. It was past 7 and the building had thinned. She could hear the HVAC and the traffic below and nothing else. She thought about Raymond Chu's word, cost. She thought about Dana, 24 years old and right about the contract, walking out of a meeting in front of 8 people having been told to read a room. She thought about Logan Mercer's hand, extended across the corner of the conference table for 2 seconds. She thought, these things are connected. They are not 3 separate events. They are the same event, repeated, in different rooms, with different people, over years. A pattern so consistent it had become invisible to her, the way anything does when it's present long enough. She opened her laptop. She began to write. Not a PR statement, not a memo to the board. Something that didn't have a category in the normal life of a CEO. A document she wrote for herself, in plain language, about what she had done and what it had cost other people. Dana's name was in it. Raymond Chu's account was in it. Logan Mercer's name was in it. She wrote for an hour and 20 minutes. Nobody knew she was doing it. It served no strategic purpose. It would never be published or presented or read by anyone who could use it. But she wrote it anyway, and when she was done, she sat back and felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Not relief, not resolution. More like the specific exhaustion that comes after you stop holding something at arm's length and finally let it land. Outside, Manhattan was doing what it always did, loud and cold and entirely indifferent. She saved the document, she closed the laptop. She drove home in the dark. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks. She was already behind, and she knew it, and she got on the highway anyway and drove. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday at 9 in the morning, in the same conference room where Logan Mercer had extended his hand 3 weeks earlier. Victoria knew this was not accidental. Houseman had chaired the scheduling, and Houseman was a man who understood that rooms carried memory, that placing a conversation in a specific location was itself a form of argument. She had always respected his intelligence. Right now she found it exhausting. She arrived at 7:30. She wanted 2 hours in the building before anyone else from the board walked in. 2 hours to sit with the room, to let it be a room again rather than a symbol, to do the thinking she needed to do without an audience. Derek arrived at 7:45 with coffee and a folder of prep materials she had already read twice. He set both on the table without speaking, which she appreciated. There were mornings when Derek's instinct for quiet was the most useful thing about him. The pre-read went to all 7 members, she asked. Yesterday at 4, he said. Houseman confirmed receipt. Park responded with 2 questions, both procedural. Reyes hasn't responded. Reyes never responds to pre-reads. I know, I'm flagging it anyway. She opened the folder, not because she needed to review the materials, but because holding something gave her hands something to do. The pre-read had taken her 4 days to write. It was the most honest document she had ever produced in a professional context. Honest about the funding round, honest about the Chu interview, honest about the pattern Raymond had described. She had not written it to save her position, or at least she had tried not to. She had written it as an attempt to put the actual situation on the table, in plain language, without the management gloss that most board communications applied by default. Whether that honesty would help or hurt, she genuinely did not know. She had sent it anyway. Elaine's coming as an observer? She asked. She confirmed last night. And Patterson? He's dialed in remotely. He won't vote, but he wanted to hear it directly. Victoria closed the folder. She looked at the conference table. The long, pale surface, the chairs arranged around it with the precision of a room that expected to matter. She looked at the corner where Logan had sat. She did not look at it for long. Whatever happens today, she said, I want you to know that I understand this is partly on me, the situation, not entirely. There are things that moved the way they moved for reasons outside my control. But the part that's on me, I own it. Derek looked at her. He was 38 years old and had worked for her for 5 years, and in 5 years she had never said anything like that to him directly. She could see him calibrating how to receive it. I know, he said finally. I'm not saying it, so you'll tell me it's fine. I know that too. He picked up his own coffee. I've been with you for 5 years. I've seen you be wrong before. I've also seen what you built. Both things are true. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said, which was also not something she said often enough, and she knew it. The board arrived between 8:50 and 9:02. Houseman first, as always, gray-suited and deliberate, the kind of man who arrived early to claim the room. Then Park, who nodded at Victoria with an expression Victoria couldn't read, and sat 2 seats from the end rather than her usual position, which meant something or meant nothing. Reyes came in at 9:01, jacket on, phone down. When Reyes put his phone down, it meant he intended to be fully present, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. The other 4 members arrived in a cluster, filling the remaining seats, arranging their materials with the careful choreography of people who understood they were participating in something significant. Elaine sat against the wall, slightly outside the table. Observer, witness. Patterson's face appeared on the screen at the far end, slightly pixelated. A hotel room somewhere in the background. Victoria looked at the room. 7 board members, 1 observer, 1 remote participant, and Derek standing by the door with a notepad he would not need to open. "Thank you all for being here," she said. "I want to start by saying something that's not in the pre-read." The room went still. "I know why we're here," she said. "Not in the procedural sense. I know the agenda. I know what brought us to this particular Thursday. And I'm not going to spend this meeting arguing about who's responsible for what or trying to control the narrative. You all read the pre-read. Everything in it is accurate. The funding round is in trouble because I made a decision in this room 3 weeks ago that cost us our lead investor. And the Chu interview described a culture pattern that I created over time and did not correct early enough." She paused. "That's the situation. I'd rather talk about what we do with it than spend 2 hours arguing about how we got here." Houseman, who had been leaning back in his chair, leaned forward. "I appreciate the candor, Victoria," he said, in the tone of a man who appreciated candor and was about to complicate it. "But the board's responsibility isn't just to acknowledge the situation. We have to evaluate whether the leadership that created it is the right leadership to resolve it." "I understand that." "Do you think it is?" he asked. Not cruelly, genuinely. She held the question. It was a good question. It was the right question, and she knew it. And the fact that she knew it was what made the next 10 seconds harder than almost anything in the meeting that followed. "I think," she said carefully, "that the person best qualified to fix a problem is often the person who understands it most completely. And I understand this one completely now, in a way I didn't 3 weeks ago." She looked at him. "But I also know that's an argument any CEO would make to keep their job, which makes it easy to discount. So I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to evaluate it against the pre-read and against whatever you've observed in the 5 years I've been sitting at this table." Reyes, who had not spoken, said, "The Chu account described a specific incident, a junior analyst named Dana. Have you spoken with her?" "I found her through HR records," Victoria said. "Her full name is Dana Reese. She's working at a firm in Boston now. I called her last week." The room shifted slightly. This was not in the pre-read. "What did you say?" Park asked. It was her first words of the meeting. "I told her what Raymond had described in the interview. I told her that I remembered the meeting, that I did not handle it correctly, and that I was sorry." Victoria looked at the table for a moment. She was quiet for a while. Then she said she appreciated the call. Then she said she hoped the company would be okay because she still believed in the technology. A pause. "That was the whole conversation." Park looked at her steadily. "How did that go for you?" "It was hard," Victoria said. "Which it should have been." The board was quiet. Houseman cleared his throat. "The immediate issue is the funding round. Patterson, you're on the line. What's your position given everything you've heard?" Patterson's face on the screen looked tired in the way of someone who had been thinking about this for days. "My position is that the 30-day extension I gave Derek is still active. I'm not withdrawing, but I'm also not leading. We need a lead commitment before I move." "We're in conversation with 2 potential replacements," Victoria said, Aldridge Partners and the Northfield Group. "Aldridge is slow," Reyes said. "They took 11 months on the Carver deal." "I know, Northfield is the primary." "What's their timeline?" "We're presenting next week. If it goes well, term sheet within 10 days. Houseman folded his hands on the table. "And if it doesn't go well?" Victoria looked at him directly. "Then we recapitalize with existing investors and restructure the growth timeline. We move more slowly. The technology doesn't change, the trajectory changes." "That would affect the team," Park said. "Retention." "Yes. Do you have a plan for that?" "I've been having one-on-ones with every senior engineer this week," Victoria said. "Not to manage the message, to actually hear where they are. Most of them are worried. Some of them are already fielding calls from other companies. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She looked at Park. What I can tell them honestly is that the core technology is sound and the leadership is taking the right steps. I can't promise outcomes I don't control. I'm done making promises I can't keep. Park nodded slowly. It was not approval exactly. It was something more like acknowledgement. The meeting ran for 2 hours and 20 minutes. They covered the funding options, the communication strategy, the response to the Chu interview, the timeline for a board decision. Houseman asked the hard questions and did not soften them, which Victoria found she preferred to the alternative. Reyes was precise and non-committal, which was his nature. Park asked the questions that mattered most. Not about numbers, but about people, about the team, about what the company felt like from the inside. At 11:22, Houseman said, "I want to call a recess. Board members only, 30 minutes." Victoria nodded. She and Derek stepped out into the corridor. She did not pace. She stood by the window at the end of the hall and looked out at the city and breathed in a way that was deliberate because her chest was tight in a way she was not going to let be visible when she went back in. Derek stood a few feet away and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. At 11:54, the door opened. Houseman stood in the frame. "We're ready," he said. His face gave away nothing. It never did. She went back in. Houseman waited until everyone was settled. Then he said, "The board has 3 concerns. First, the funding round. Second, the culture issues raised in the Chu interview. Third, the broader question of leadership." And he looked at Victoria. "We are not making a final determination today on the third point. We are giving the Northfield presentation 10 days. If the outcome is favorable and the round stabilizes, we will reconvene with a full confidence review. If it is not favorable, the board will meet again to discuss leadership options." Victoria looked at him. "And the Chu response?" "The board is asking you to author a direct public statement, not from PR, from you personally, acknowledging the culture issues and outlining specific concrete steps within 72 hours. "I can do that." "Not a managed statement," Reyes said. "We'll know the difference." "I know you will," she said. Houseman looked at her for a long moment. He was 63 years old and had sat on 11 corporate boards and had seen, she knew, every variation of a CEO in a difficult room. She could not tell what he was thinking and had learned over 5 years that this was his most formidable quality. 10 days, he said. 10 days, she said. She wrote the public statement herself at her kitchen table that night. She started at 8 and finished the first draft at 10:15 and then deleted the last 3 paragraphs and rewrote them because they had drifted into the language of corporate contrition, the careful, lawyered cadence of a statement designed to look honest while protecting against liability. She had written that kind of statement before. She knew what it felt like in her hands, and it felt like that, and she cut it. The final version named Dana Reese by name, with Dana's permission, which she had obtained in a second call that afternoon. It described the incident plainly. It did not use the word misstep or learning moment or process improvement. It said, "I was wrong to do this. I made a person who was right feel like a liability for being right, and she left because of it. And that is a failure of leadership that I am responsible for." It also said, "I do not expect trust to be rebuilt by a statement. Trust is rebuilt by what happens next. I am asking for the chance to show what happens next." She published it the following morning. The response was not uniformly positive. There were people who read it as calculated, as a CEO, trying to survive a board review through the performance of accountability. She understood why they read it that way. She had read similar statements herself in similar situations and thought the same thing. But Dana Reese posted something on her own LinkedIn that afternoon. She did not tag the company. She did not endorse Victoria or call for forgiveness. She simply wrote, "I received a phone call last week that I wasn't expecting. For what it's worth, it was real." And then nothing else. That post got more engagement than the statement itself. Victoria saw it at 6 in the evening and sat with her phone for a long time. The Northfield presentation was on a Tuesday. Victoria had spent 6 days preparing it differently than she'd prepared any presentation in her career. Not in terms of the materials. The materials were as strong as she could make them. The technology laid out clearly, the financials honest about the challenges. The difference was in herself. She had spent 6 days trying to locate and dismantle the specific reflex that had cost her in the Sterling boardroom. The fast sorting, the hierarchy of worth, the automatic dismissal. She didn't know if 6 days was enough. She suspected it wasn't, but she had to start somewhere. Northfield's managing partners were 3 people. A woman named Christine Adler, who was known in the industry for asking questions nobody else thought to ask. A man named Gabe Torrance, who had the energy of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and still found it interesting. And a third partner named Sam, who was 29 and said almost nothing in the first hour, and then asked the 2 questions that turned out to matter most. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Victoria answered every question directly, including the ones about the Chu interview, including the one Adler asked about Logan Mercer's withdrawal, which she answered honestly. He withdrew because of how I conducted that meeting. That's the straightforward version. Adler looked at her for a moment. And the less straightforward version? The less straightforward version is that his withdrawal forced a conversation I should have been having with myself for a long time. And that conversation changed how I'm sitting in this room today. Gabe Torrance leaned forward. Changed how? I'm listening more carefully, she said, to the questions under the questions, to what people aren't saying. She paused. I missed a lot of things because I was too sure I already knew what was in the room. Sam, the 29-year-old who had been quiet for most of the meeting, wrote something on his notepad. Victoria noticed but did not adjust her posture, did not redirect toward him, did not try to read what he'd written. She stayed with Torrance. The technology, Torrance said, we're not questioning. We know what it is. The question we're evaluating is whether the leadership environment can deliver on it. I know, Victoria said. How do we know the environment has changed? She thought about Dana Reese's 3-line LinkedIn post. It was real. She thought about the one-on-ones with the engineering team, the conversations she'd had in the past 2 weeks with people who had been calculating cost for years and were now, tentatively, speaking more plainly. You don't know yet, she said, and I'm not going to ask you to take my word for it. What I can tell you is that the team you'd be investing in, the engineers, the people who built the core platform, they're still here, and they're still building, and they deserve a stable environment to keep doing it. That's the investment. The leadership is accountable to that. Sam looked up from his notepad. I have a question, he said. Everyone at the table looked at him. He was young enough that his directness still had the quality of something slightly unexpected. If this round had gone smoothly, he said to Victoria, if Logan Mercer had stayed in and the funding closed on schedule and none of the public scrutiny happened, do you think you'd be sitting in this meeting the way you're sitting in it right now? The room was very quiet. Victoria looked at him for a moment. He was 29, and he had just asked the most honest question anyone had asked her in 2 months, and she owed him an answer that matched it. No, she said. I don't think I would. He nodded, wrote something else. The meeting ended without a decision, which she'd expected. Northfield would take 2 weeks to deliberate. She drove back to the office through midtown traffic that barely moved, and she sat in it without frustration, which was new, and thought about Sam's question, and thought about the answer she'd given, and thought about what it meant that the honest answer was no. Logan heard about the Northfield meeting through Priya, who heard through the network of people who tracked these things and reported to her, and who relayed the basic outline to Logan without editorializing. He was in his office when she told him, a real office, though a modest one, 3 rooms on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown that most people walked past without looking at. He'd had the same space for 6 years. The carpet needed replacing, and he kept meaning to address it, and kept not addressing it, which Marcus had long since stopped commenting on. Northfield, he said. Christine Adler's group, Priya confirmed. The meeting ran 3 hours. 3 hours is good. Generally. Priya looked at him with the specific neutrality she used when she had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. She'd worked for him for 4 years, and he could read the neutrality like a language. What? He said. She published a statement, Priya said, about the culture issues 3 days ago. It's different from the usual kind. She set a printout on his desk. He looked at it for a moment before picking it up. He read it the way he read everything, fully, once, quickly, then a second time more slowly. He read the paragraph about Dana Reese. He read the sentence, "I made a person who was right feel like a liability for being right." He read the last paragraph. "I do not expect trust to be rebuilt by a statement. Trust is rebuilt by what happens next." He set it down. Priya was watching him. "It's either very honest or very good strategy," she said. "Could be both," he said. "Could be." She paused. Dana Reese posted something. "It's in there, second page." He turned to the second page, read the 3 lines. It was real. He thought about the coffee shop. Victoria's hands around the coffee cup, not quite warm. The way she'd said, not strategically, wrong. "I know the difference." The look on her face when he'd confirmed plainly that she was, in fact, not great at sitting with her own accountability. He thought about the document she had written alone in her office, the one nobody had seen. He didn't know about the document, had no way of knowing, but he thought about what it would take for a person with her specific armor to get to a place of producing that statement. And he thought the distance between where she had been and where she was now was not a distance you covered without doing some hard private work along the way. He picked up his phone. He typed, "I read the statement. For what it's worth, I think it landed correctly. The Northfield meeting running 3 hours is a good sign. I hope it works out." He stared at it for a moment. Then he sent it. The response came 4 minutes later. "Thank you. That means more than it probably should." A pause of about 30 seconds, and then, "How's your daughter?" He looked at that for a moment. It was an unexpected question. It was the kind of question a person asks when they've been paying attention to the details when they've filed something away that they weren't required to file. He typed back, "She's good. She's been explaining the water cycle to me for 2 weeks. Apparently things keep going." He sent it before overthinking it. A longer pause this time. Then, "She sounds like someone worth listening to." He put the phone in his pocket. Outside his window, Midtown moved in its usual way. Loud, dense, full of people going somewhere with urgency and purpose. He sat with his coffee and thought about 2 weeks from now, when Northfield would give their answer, and about what it meant that he was paying attention. He wasn't sure yet, but he was paying attention. The rake was back in the garage, finally. He had put it away 3 days ago. Northfield's answer came on a Friday morning, 12 days after the presentation. Christine Adler called Victoria directly, which was itself a signal. Term sheet decisions at that level were typically relayed through intermediaries, through assistants and deal teams. The actual principals insulated from the moment of delivery by a layer of professional distance. The fact that Adler called herself meant something. Victoria was in the car when the call came in, parked in the garage beneath the building, not yet ready to go upstairs. She had been doing this more often lately, sitting in the car for a few minutes before the day began, which was new behavior for her, something that had developed in the past few weeks as a form of preparation she hadn't needed before and now found she couldn't do without. A few minutes in the quiet before the noise. She picked up on the second ring. "Christine?" "Victoria." A brief pause, not hesitation, just the beat of someone who had made a decision and was locating the right tone for delivering it. "We're in." Victoria sat with those 2 words for a moment. "Lead position?" she asked. "Lead position. The term sheet goes to your legal team this afternoon. We're proposing $220 million, slightly above your ask, structured with a 12-month milestone review on the second tranche. The milestone parameters? Retention metrics, revenue targets, and a culture audit at 6 months. Third party, independently administered." A pause. That last piece was Sam's condition. He was firm on it. Victoria thought about Sam, 29 years old and quiet for most of the meeting before asking the question that cut to the center of everything. "If this round had gone smoothly, do you think you'd be sitting here the way you're sitting here now?" "Tell Sam I think that's the right condition," she said. A brief silence. "I'll tell him." Adler's voice shifted slightly. Warmer, less transactional. "For what it's worth, Victoria, the meeting you gave us was different from what I expected. My team talked about it for 3 days afterward." "Different how?" "You came in without the performance of certainty. That's rarer than it sounds." Victoria looked through the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking garage. "It wasn't a strategy," she said. "I just ran out of certainty." Adler made a sound that might have been a short laugh. "Maybe that's the same thing," she said. "We'll talk next week. Congratulations on getting to the other side of this." The call ended. Victoria sat in the car for another 5 minutes. The parking garage was dim and quiet and smelled of concrete and exhaust, and it was genuinely not a place anyone would choose to receive important news. She had received it there anyway, which felt right somehow. Not cinematic, not polished, just real. Just a woman in a car in a parking garage who had nearly lost everything she'd built and had not this time lost it. She thought about calling Derek. She thought about calling Elaine. She did both, briefly, and both conversations were short because the news was simple and complete and didn't require decoration. Then she sat in the car a few minutes more and thought about the distance between the person who had walked into that conference room 3 weeks before Northfield and the person sitting in this car now. She tried to measure it. She couldn't, not precisely, but she could feel it. The way you feel a healed injury when you move in a certain direction. Not pain, but the memory of pain. A reminder that something had happened there. She drove upstairs and went to work. The term sheet was signed 12 days later. Patterson confirmed his commitment within 48 hours of the Northfield announcement. The 2 other conditional investors followed within a week. The round closed at $240 million, larger than the original target, restructured with the milestone reviews Sam had insisted on and Victoria had accepted without negotiation because they were right and she knew they were right. Elaine Cho called to congratulate her, and they had a real conversation, maybe the first real one since the boardroom 3 weeks before Logan walked in. Elaine said, toward the end of it, "You know, I've seen a lot of CEOs navigate something like this. Most of them come out the other side managing the story. You came out the other side having actually changed something." "I don't know if that's true yet," Victoria said. "Ask me in a year." "Fair enough," Elaine said. The board's full confidence review happened 2 weeks after the round closed. Housemen ran it with the same measured gravity he brought to everything. The vote was 6-1 in Victoria's favor, which she accepted without asking who the one dissent had been, because it didn't matter, and because whoever it was had the right to hold their position. She thanked the board and left the room, and in the hallway she stood for a moment against the wall and closed her eyes and breathed. And Derek, who was waiting a few feet away, had the decency not to speak first. "Okay," she said eventually. "Okay," he said. They went back to work. 6 months later, the culture audit came back. Victoria read it alone in her office, all 42 pages, on a Tuesday morning when the building was still quiet. She had requested the full document, not the summary, and the third-party firm had delivered exactly what they'd been hired to deliver, an honest account. It was not uniformly critical. There were sections that reflected genuine improvement. The engineering team's responses had shifted measurably from the internal surveys conducted 2 years earlier, and the data on escalation rates, on how often junior employees raised issues through formal channels, had moved in the right direction. But there were sections that were hard to read. The patterns ran deeper than 6 months of corrective effort could fully address. The culture that Raymond Chu had described, the calculus of cost, the careful management of visibility around difficult truths, didn't dissolve because a CEO wrote a statement and started conducting one-on-ones. It receded. It became less dominant, but it was still there in the responses of people who had learned a certain way of operating over years, who were still calibrating whether the new signals were real or temporary. One respondent, anonymous, had written, "Things are better. I'm watching to see if they stay better. I'm not convinced yet." Victoria read that sentence 3 times. She wrote it on a Post-it note and put it on the inside cover of the audit folder, where she would see it every time she opened it. She did not share the audit selectively. She sent the full document to Northfield's team, to the board, and to her senior leadership with a note that said, "This is where we are, not where we're trying to be. Where we are. The gap between those 2 things is the work." Sam at Northfield responded within an hour. This is exactly what a 6-month audit is supposed to look like. The "I'm not convinced yet" response is the one to pay attention to. She wrote back, "I know. I have it on my desk." Raymond Chu had taken her call the week after the board meeting, which had surprised her. He had been wary. She could hear it in his voice, the careful distance of someone who had already paid a cost for speaking plainly and was measuring whether speaking plainly again was worth the risk. She hadn't asked him to retract anything or soften the record. She had told him that the account he'd given was accurate and that she was sorry for the environment he'd worked in and that the specific things he'd described were being addressed. Then she had asked him a question. What was the one thing in his time at the company that he had wanted to say to her directly and hadn't? He was quiet for a long moment. "You were building something real," he said finally. "The technology was genuinely good, and you were so focused on defending it, on proving that it deserved to exist, that you stopped being able to hear anything that felt like a threat to it, including feedback, including dissent, including he paused, "including people." "Yes," she said. "That's it," he said. "That's the whole thing." She thanked him. She did not ask for anything further. They had not spoken again after that call, but she thought about what he'd said regularly, the way you think about something that has the quality of a precise diagnosis. Not comfortable, but useful in the way that accurate things are useful, even when they hurt. Logan heard about the round closing through Marcus, who had heard through the normal channels of an industry that tracked these things. He was at his desk, going through the Rothenberg portfolio review, when Marcus appeared in the doorway with the particular expression he wore when he had something to report that wasn't strictly business. "Sterling closed the round," Marcus said. Logan looked up. "Northfield lead. Northfield lead, 240 total." "Good." He looked at his desk for a moment. "That's good for the company." Marcus nodded. He stood in the doorway a second longer than necessary. "You want me to send anything?" Logan thought about it. "No," he said. "I already said what needed to be said." Marcus nodded and left. Logan sat for a moment with the information. He thought about the Monday morning in his Westchester office when he'd made the call to withdraw, when the decision had been clean and uncomplicated because it needed to be. He thought about everything that had moved since then. The conversations, the coffee shop, the text messages, the statement he'd read 3 times. He thought about Victoria Sterling in that parking garage, which he didn't know about specifically, but he thought about whoever she had been in the moments when nobody was watching, in the hours of private reckoning that produced the public record. He thought about the fact that he'd meant it when he sent the message about the statement landing correctly. He'd meant it simply, without agenda, the way you mean a thing when it's just true. He picked up the Rothenberg file and went back to work. What? In March, 7 months after the round closed, Logan was invited to speak at a business conference in Midtown. The invitation had come through a professional contact framed as a conversation about investment philosophy and the future of mid-market funding. He said yes, which was unusual. He said yes to very few public things, because the topic was one he actually wanted to talk about, and because the format was conversational rather than a formal address, which suited him. The conference was in a hotel ballroom that held about 400 people. Logan arrived early and stood in the back for a few minutes before going on, watching the crowd assemble. The specific mix of a mid-market business conference, investors and operators and people who were somewhere between those two things, all in various stages of pretending they were not networking while networking. He thought about what he wanted to say. He went on at 11 and talked for 40 minutes. He did not prepare remarks in the formal sense. He had notes on an index card, 3 phrases to anchor the conversation, and everything else he trusted himself to find in the room. He had always been a better speaker when he was finding the thing rather than delivering it. He talked about what he looked for in a company, not metrics, not projections, but the quality of attention that leadership paid to the people below them. He talked about his early career, about the mistake he had made at 28, the meeting where he had dismissed someone based on appearance and been completely wrong and lost a significant amount of money and sat in his office afterward for a long time. He talked about what that had cost and what it had taught him. He talked about respect, specifically, not as an abstraction, not as a corporate value to be laminated and posted in a lobby, but as a practice, as something you either do or don't do in the specific moment when the cost of doing it is visible and the person in front of you has nothing obvious to offer in return. The clearest test of a person's character, he said, isn't how they treat people who can do something for them. Everybody manages that reasonably well. The test is how they treat people when the ledger appears empty, when the person in front of you looks, on the surface, like they don't matter to what you're trying to accomplish. He paused. Because that's the moment where you find out what you actually believe about the worth of people. And those moments compound. They build a record. And eventually, that record is who you are. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something lands in them. He talked about the fund he'd been building for the past few months. He had not announced it publicly until now, and saying it in this room felt like the right context, the right moment. Mercer Foundational Fund, an investment vehicle specifically structured to back entrepreneurs who had been systematically overlooked. Not overlooked because their ideas were weak, but because the rooms where funding happened had decided, at the first glance, that these people didn't belong. The wrong suit, the wrong background, the wrong institution, the wrong zip code. He said the fund's first 3 investments were already placed, and that all 3 companies were doing exactly what he had expected them to do. He did not mention Victoria Sterling by name. Not once. Not because the story wasn't relevant. It was directly relevant. It was the root of everything he was saying. But because the story wasn't his to tell in this room. It was hers. He left the stage to genuine, sustained applause, which he acknowledged briefly and then moved off to the side, the way he always did, before anyone could turn it into something larger than it was. The conference host tried to pull him into a group of people who wanted to talk, and he spent 20 minutes in that conversation and was genuine in it. And then he excused himself and found the exit and walked out into the March air and stood on the sidewalk and breathed. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Victoria. I watched the stream, the part about the test of character. I'm going to think about that for a long time. A pause of a few seconds, then, the fund is a good thing. I mean that. He stood on the sidewalk and thought about what to write back. He thought about the coffee shop, about the fracture in her composure in the Sterling conference room, about Dana Reese's 3 words, it was real, and about what it meant that a person could start from a place of such complete and defended wrongness and move, painfully and without guarantee, in a different direction. He typed, "How's the audit going?" She wrote back after a minute, 6 months in. Honestly? Better in some places, not enough in others. I have a post-it on my desk that says, "I'm not convinced yet." Anonymous survey respondent. It keeps me from celebrating too early. He thought about that. A post-it on a desk. A specific deliberate choice to keep the uncomfortable thing visible rather than file it away where it couldn't reach you. He typed, "That's the right thing to have on your desk." She responded, "I know, it's uncomfortable," which is probably the point. He put the phone away and walked to the parking garage 2 blocks north and got in the old Volvo and drove back toward Westchester. The city moved past him in the familiar way, dense and loud and full of motion, and he thought about what he'd said in that ballroom, about records and character and the moments that build them. He thought about his own record, the things he'd gotten right and the things he hadn't, the mistake at 28 and the correction it had produced, Claire and the years after Claire and the architecture of a life built around thinking clearly and staying real. Nora, who had told him at 8 years old that things don't just stop, they keep going, and who had been describing the water cycle but had been right about everything else too. He thought about respect as a practice, not an instinct, a practice, something you had to choose repeatedly in specific moments against the current of the reflex that wanted to shortcut it. He was not immune to the reflex. Nobody was. The question was whether you caught it and what you did when you did. He had not been perfect. He had been, on balance, consistent. And consistency was what the record was made of. Victoria spent the following year doing the hardest work of her career, which had nothing to do with the technology or the funding or the clients. It had to do with learning, at 33, how to lead differently than she had led for 7 years. Not to undo the work, not to apologize for the results, but to change the fundamental quality of attention she brought to the people around her. It was slow. It was imperfect. There were weeks when she slipped back into the old patterns, when the pressure of a deadline or the frustration of a difficult quarter produced the familiar impatience, the quick sorting, the reflex toward dismissal. She noticed it faster now. She corrected it faster. She apologized more directly and less strategically than she ever had before. She had a standing monthly lunch with Dana Reese, who had come back to New York for a new role and who had, over the course of 6 months of careful conversation, become something that Victoria had not had enough of in her professional life: an honest voice. Dana was 25 now, sharp and unafraid, in the specific way of someone who had already paid a cost for speaking plainly and had survived it. She said things to Victoria that nobody on the senior team would say, and Victoria listened in a way she had not been capable of 2 years earlier. In one of those lunches, Dana said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead," Victoria said. "Do you ever resent it, the way all of this happened? The public piece, the board review, the audit, the fact that it was all so visible?" Victoria thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," she said. "There's a version of me that wishes I'd figured all of this out privately, without the spectacle." She looked at the table. "But I think if it had been private, I might not have actually done it. The visibility created a kind of accountability I couldn't manage around. I couldn't just tell myself I was changing. The record was there." Dana nodded. "The record," she said. "Yeah." Victoria looked at her. "You're part of my record. I want you to know I understand that." Dana was quiet for a moment. Then, "I do know. That's why I come to these lunches." It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more durable than forgiveness. A relationship built on accuracy, on both people knowing precisely what had happened and choosing to keep showing up anyway. Victoria valued it more than almost anything else in her professional life, which told her something about how far she had come and how far she still had to go. The Mercer Foundational Fund made its 6th investment in April, 14 months after Logan had announced it from that ballroom stage. The company was a logistics operation built by a woman named Carla Voss, who had spent 12 years driving long-haul routes before she identified a structural inefficiency in last-mile delivery that was costing mid-sized carriers significant money. She had no institutional background. She had a community college degree and a prototype she had built with money borrowed from her sister. She had been turned down by 11 investors before Marcus found her through the network of overlooked founders the fund had been quietly building. Logan met with her in a conference room in his modest midtown office. She arrived in a jacket that was slightly too big and sat down with the careful posture of someone who was trying not to look like she was trying. She had a printed deck, not a digital one. She had printed it at a FedEx the night before, and one of the pages had a slight smear on it. He shook her hand when she came in. He asked her 3 questions in the first 10 minutes. What problem she was solving, who would be hurt if she failed, and what had she gotten wrong so far. She answered all 3 without deflecting. He offered a term sheet before she left the building. Walking back to his office afterward, Marcus said, "You didn't even look at the deck." "I read it last night," Logan said. "You could have told her that." "I know." He thought about it. "I should have." He went back to her and told her. It was a small thing, but small things had a way of building the record, and he knew this better than most. What? On a Saturday in late October, Logan was raking leaves in the backyard again. The same yard, the same season, a full year past the morning he had driven into Manhattan and parked in a garage and paid for 2 hours and come out with nothing he'd intended to come out with. Nora was 9 now. She was inside doing something on her tablet that she had described to him as extremely important research, and which he strongly suspected involved horses. He could hear, faintly, the sound of the television from the living room, which meant she had turned it on while doing the extremely important research, which was a violation of their standing agreement, which he had decided to address after the leaves were done. His phone buzzed. Victoria. The second tranche milestone came in. "We hit the targets. Northfield confirmed this morning." He stopped raking. He looked at the phone for a moment. He thought about $240 million and the 12-month milestone review and a 6-month culture audit with a post-it note on the desk, and an anonymous respondent who had written, "I'm not convinced yet," and a 25-year-old woman named Dana Reese who showed up to lunch once a month and said the true things. He typed, "Congratulations, you earned it." Her response took a few minutes. When it came, "I keep thinking about something you said at the conference, about how those moments compound, how they build a record. I think about that every week." Another pause. "I think the record is better now. Not fixed. Better." He read this standing in the October yard with the rake in one hand and his phone in the other and the smell of leaves and cold air around him. He thought, better is not fixed. Better is what you get when you do the work without a guarantee that the work is enough. Better is what you get when you keep showing up. After the moment of accountability is over and there's nobody watching and the only reason to continue is because it's the right thing to do. He typed, better is the whole thing. Fixed is a story we tell ourselves. She wrote back after a minute, I'm putting that on the post-it. He smiled, put the phone in his pocket. Dad? Nora was at the back door, tablet in hand, wearing the expression of someone who believed she was not in trouble and was testing that belief. Are you almost done? Getting there? Can we get dinner from the place with the pie? He looked at the yard. He looked at his daughter. He thought about a water cycle diagram on a kitchen table and the specific absolute certainty of an 8-year-old, now 9, explaining that things don't just stop, they keep going. Yeah, he said. Give me 10 minutes. She disappeared back inside. He heard the television click off, which meant she had made her own calculation about the terms of negotiation. He went back to the leaves. The yard took another 15 minutes. He worked it all the way to the edges, raked it clean, and when he was done, he leaned the rake against the back fence and looked at the work for a moment. Then he put it away in the garage because he was done thinking. He went inside to get his daughter, Tom. There is a thing that the best stories about power and failure and the cost of arrogance tend to get wrong. They make the fall cinematic and the rise triumphant and the lesson clean, and in doing so, they miss the part that is actually true, that people do not change in a single moment. The single moment is only the door. Walking through it is the whole rest of the story. Victoria Sterling walked through a door in that conference room when she turned away from a hand that had been extended in basic human decency. Everything that followed, the withdrawal, the coverage, the board meeting, the audit, the post-it note, the monthly lunches with a woman she had once dismissed in front of 8 people, was the work of walking through the door after the door had opened. Unglamorous work, repetitive work, work without a guarantee that it would be recognized or rewarded or sufficient. Logan Mercer had walked through a similar door years earlier in a different conference room and had spent the intervening years building a life and a practice around what he had learned. He was not the lesson of Victoria's story. He was a person with his own losses and his own choices and his own rake leaning against a fence while he stood in a yard and figured something out. He had gotten things wrong. He would get things wrong again. The difference was in the paying attention. The fund he built would make 17 investments over the next 3 years. Not all of them would succeed. Some of the people he backed would turn out to be wrong about the ideas they'd brought him, or right about the ideas and wrong about the execution, or right about everything and still undone by circumstances nobody had predicted. That was the nature of it. He had always understood this. The investment was not in the certainty of the outcome. The investment was in the quality of the person, in the genuine thing they were trying to build, in the belief, grounded and correctable but real, that overlooked did not mean wrong. Victoria's company went on. It went on imperfectly, with setbacks and quarters that didn't land and a series of personnel changes in the second year that were painful and necessary in the way that surgical things are painful and necessary. The technology was real and remained real and continued to find its way into industries it hadn't occupied before. The culture audit at 18 months was better than the one at 6. The anonymous respondent who had written, "I'm not convinced yet," wrote, at 18 months, "Things are different. I'm staying." Victoria printed that one too and put it on the same post-it note, layered over the first, so both were on the desk. She did not become a different person. She became a more complete version of the one she had always been, the one who had survived the accident at 20 and built something from nothing and defended it against real opposition, but who had also, somewhere in the defense, built walls where there should have been windows. She was 34 now, and she was still learning the difference. Dana Reese stayed in the monthly lunches. Raymond Chu and Victoria never became close, but they ran into each other at an industry event 14 months later and had a 20-minute conversation that was honest and oddly comfortable. The conversation of two people who had told the truth about each other and come out the other side of it intact. He was building something of his own now. She wished him well and meant it. Logan and Victoria spoke occasionally, not often, not in the way of close friends, but in the way of two people who had been through something at the same time from different angles and had, on the other side of it, a quality of mutual recognition that didn't require maintenance or proximity. He asked about the company sometimes. She asked about the fund. He mentioned Nora occasionally, and she asked questions that suggested she had paid attention to what he said about her, which he appreciated without analyzing too carefully. It was not a neat resolution. Two people did not fall into each other's orbit and become something complete. They became instead people who had been changed by the same sequence of events, who carried the marks of it differently, who were both still in the middle of the work. The work was not finished. The work, that was the whole point, was never finished. You kept doing it or you didn't. You kept choosing it in the specific moments when the choice was visible and the reflex pointed in a different direction, or you let the reflex win and you built, choice by choice, a different record. What Logan had said in that ballroom, that the test of character is how you treat people when the ledger appears empty, was not a new idea. It was one of the oldest observations about human behavior that existed. But ideas age into cliché, not because they stop being true, but because they stop being practiced. Because people mistake the familiarity of the phrase for having done the thing the phrase describes. The hand across the corner of a conference table. 2 seconds. The simplest possible gesture, extended toward a person who had decided, in 10 seconds of automatic sorting, that it wasn't worth receiving. Everything in the story that followed, the withdrawal, the investigation, the coverage, the board meeting, the audit, the fund, the monthly lunches, the post-it note, everything was the consequence of those 2 seconds and what they revealed. Not about one person's cruelty, about one person's carelessness. The carelessness of a person who had been so focused on protecting something that she had stopped noticing the cost she was charging other people to be around her. It is a specific failure. It is a common one. And the correction of it, the slow, imperfect, unglamorous correction, was not a story about redemption in the dramatic sense. It was a story about a person deciding, when given the evidence, to do the harder thing instead of the easier one. That is all it ever is. Nora Mercer was 9 years old and was growing up in a house where the heat ran reliably and the refrigerator held her specific brand of fruit snacks, and her father made her lunch every morning and sometimes sat in the yard for a long time before he figured something out. She did not know the details of any of this story. She knew her father was someone who paid attention, who drove an old car by choice, who asked her real questions and waited for real answers. She knew that when he said, "That's a good point," he meant it. She knew that he put things away when he was done thinking. She was 9. She was already learning, from a source she couldn't have named, that people were worth full attention. That is how it passes. Not in speeches. In the daily practice of a person who has decided what they believe about the worth of other people, and then, day after day, in the small specific moments where it costs something, acts accordingly. The rake was in the garage. The leaves were done. He went inside.